I had been camping alone for 2 days in a remote valley an hour north of Fairbanks, Alaska, near the White Mountains. My tent sat beside a clear creek, and the endless daylight of the northern summer made the place feel untouched by time. That afternoon I sat by the fire eating lunch, surrounded by nothing but still air, and the quiet hiss of burning wood. No birds, no footsteps, no sound but my own breath, until a man appeared. I hadn't heard him approach. One moment I was alone. The next he was standing 10 feet away, a stranger with a backpack and hiking gear, dressed like any other camper. He smiled politely and asked if I knew where the cabin was. I'd heard about small public shelters along the trails, crumbling wooden huts left for hikers to use, but I'd never visited this one. I told him that if a cabin existed, it was likely down a narrow path branching off the main trail. He nodded, thanked me, and walked away into the trees. The forest swallowed him in silence. The rest of the day passed quietly. I tended the fire, enjoyed the scenery, and let the stillness settle around me. It was my last night before heading back, and the sky was painted with that strange Alaskan twilight where the sun never fully sets. Around 10 o'clock, as I sat near the dying fire, I saw movement at the edge of the woods. The same man stepped out of the shadows. His expression was calm but unreadable. He said he never found the shelter and asked if I could show him where it was. The request made my stomach tighten. He'd been gone for hours, too long to have been wandering nearby. I asked what he meant, and he said he never found the path I mentioned. When I told him again where it was, he insisted I walk him there, saying he didn't have a tent and needed the shelter for the night. I hesitated, but eventually gave in. We walked through the forest. The air was cold and damp, and he followed silently behind me. His boots made no sound. 10 minutes later, I found the narrow path exactly where I'd seen it before, the faint line winding through the trees toward a small structure far ahead. "There," I said, pointing. "You couldn't have missed it." He didn't answer. He stared at the cabin and said flatly, "That's not the right one." Confused, I turned to him, ready to ask what he meant, but his face had changed. His eyes were dull, expression lifeless. As I took a step back, light caught the edge of something metallic in his hand. "A knife. Go inside," he said. The words came out slow and empty. I froze, realizing that stepping into that cabin meant disappearing forever. I tried to reason with him, offering food or help finding the road, but he only repeated the same 2 words. My hand tightened on my packstrap, and in one motion I threw it at the ground and ran. Branches tore at my arms as I sprinted through the forest. The only sound was the thudding of my heartbeat. I expected to hear him chasing me, but there was nothing. When I dared to glance back, he was still standing near the cabin, knife in hand, motionless. I ran until my lungs burned, then hid beneath a cluster of birch trees, waiting in silence. Minutes dragged on like hours. When the wind finally calmed, I decided to sneak back toward my campsite. I moved quietly through the dark, guided by the faint gray light of the northern dusk. My tent came into view in a flicker of orange light. My campfire was burning again. I had let it die hours ago. I crouched behind a fallen log, heart pounding. The tent was still standing. The fire crackled softly. In the middle of the clearing sat my backpack, perfectly placed upright near the flames. Everything about it screamed trap. Then he stepped into the firelight. The same man, calm. He tossed sticks into the fire and sat cross-legged, humming an off-key tune, his face relaxed as if he were waiting for a friend. The sound drifted through the trees, low and eerie. He didn't look around. He just stared into the flames. I backed away, forcing each step to be silent. I found the main trail and followed it through the dark for hours until I reached the road. When I finally flagged down a passing car, my voice was shaking as I begged for help. The next morning, I returned with police and rangers. There was nothing. No trace of the man, no tent, no bag, not even the fire pit, just scattered stones thrown back into the woods. They told me the cabin in that area was abandoned years ago and no longer maintained. I've spent years trying to forget that night, but sometimes when I close my eyes, I still see him sitting by the fire, humming, waiting for me to come back. It was the second night of our camping trip in Maine. My friend Ethan and I had hiked deep into the woods, far from any official trail, setting up near a still, murky pond that reflected the moon like a sheet of glass. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the forest felt completely detached from civilization. We were both experienced campers, comfortable in the dark silence that made most people uneasy. That night we sat by the fire, trading stories and laughing softly as the flames cracked. Everything felt peaceful until we heard a splash from the pond. It wasn't the sound of a fish or an animal. It was too heavy, deliberate. We aimed our flashlights across the water, catching only ripples spreading across the surface. Nothing moved, but something about that silence afterward felt unnatural. Ethan joked that maybe a beaver jumped in, but I noticed the ripples kept forming one after another, as if something were moving slowly beneath the surface toward us. Then it stopped. The pond was perfectly still again. We brushed it off, but the tension lingered. We turned in for the night. I zipped my sleeping bag and drifted in and out of sleep, listening to the faint rustle of wind through the trees. Then came another sound, soft splashing. I sat up, thinking maybe Ethan was outside. When I unzipped the tent and looked out, the fire was nothing but red embers, and he wasn't there. The splashing continued. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out. The night air was cold against my face. The light beam cut through the mist rising from the pond, and that's when I saw it. Letters scratched into the muddy shore. Big letters, fresh. They spelled "Help me." My chest tightened. I called out for Ethan, but there was no answer. I thought maybe it was a sick joke, but when I shined the light over the message again, I saw new ripples forming in the center of the pond. Then Ethan's voice echoed from behind me. "Did you write that?" I spun around. He was standing there, flashlight in hand, pale and confused. "I thought you were joking," I said. "You didn't write it?" He shook his head. The two of us stood there in silence, staring at the words by the water. They were still dripping. We backed away from the shore and returned to camp, keeping the fire alive the rest of the night. Every so often we'd hear another faint splash or something dragging through the reeds, but we told ourselves it was just wildlife. Neither of us slept. When morning came, the words were gone. The mud looked smooth, untouched. We both swore we'd seen them, but there wasn't a single trace left. Still uneasy, we decided to stay one more night to prove to ourselves that it had just been our minds playing tricks. The day passed quietly, but that night the air felt heavier, colder. Around midnight, Ethan went to fill our bottles at the pond. He took the lantern and disappeared into the trees. Minutes passed. Then I heard him yell my name. I grabbed a flashlight and ran toward the sound. The beam caught the water, and Ethan's backpack floating near the edge. He was standing waist-deep in the pond, staring down at something under the surface. His voice was shaking when he said, "There's someone down here." I shouted for him to get out. He stumbled back to shore, drenched and pale. He said he saw a face just under the water, eyes open, staring straight up at him. We grabbed our gear and ran for the trail, not caring where it led. When we finally reached the road, it was already morning. We never spoke to anyone about it, but years later I looked up missing persons reports from that area. There had been one, a hiker gone missing near a pond in the same forest the year before our trip. They never found his body. Sometimes I wonder if what we saw that night was a warning, or if the pond was still waiting for someone else to read its message. It was 2016, but I remember that night as if it just happened. I often hiked through the woods south of town, at least 4 or 5 times a year, just to get away and clear my head. That weekend I had one of those urges to disappear into the quiet for a day or two, so I grabbed my gear, drove down to a rarely used trail, and hiked for 2 hours to the end. It was flat, densely wooded, and completely empty, perfect for a solo camp. I pitched my tent as the sun began to sink, the forest turning from gold to gray in minutes. The moment the light faded, the woods went silent, as if someone had cut the sound out of the world. I sat by the fire listening to the crackle of wood when I heard something strange. Music. Faint at first, barely a melody, like a radio far off through the trees. As it grew louder, I recognized it. Classical music, something slow and orchestral, so crisp it couldn't be a wind illusion. I turned off my phone to check. It wasn't me. The sound was real and coming from deep in the forest. At first I told myself someone was camping nearby with a speaker, but the more I listened, the more wrong it felt. It didn't fade in or out. It stayed steady and perfectly clear, as if it were playing in the air around me. Then it stopped. Silence. A few minutes later, it started again from a different direction. Every hair on my arm stood up. I stoked the fire higher and pretended to ignore it. The music stopped again, and for a long time I heard nothing but my own heartbeat. Then something moved just outside the ring of light. Leaves crunched, slow, measured steps, then silence again. I held my knife tight and waited. After a minute, the music resumed, louder than before, now clearly coming from the same direction as the footsteps. I decided to leave. I grabbed my flashlight and headed down the trail, telling myself I'd come back for the tent in the morning. The music followed, still faint but constant, never closer yet, never fading away. After a while it stopped and I let myself breathe again. That's when I saw something on the path ahead, metal glinting in the light. I moved closer and froze. Someone had arranged my missing camping tools in a perfect line across the trail. Knife, pepper spray, utensils. Every item that had been in my bag. Before I could react, I heard footsteps charging from behind. I spun around but saw nothing, just darkness and the echo of movement. I ran. Branches slashed my arms as I sprinted through the trees. I didn't look back until I burst onto the road and collapsed by my car, chest heaving. The music was gone. I never retrieved my camp gear. I don't know who or what was out there, or how they found my things to lay them out like that. Sometimes I think about how the music moved through the trees like it was alive, and how it stopped every time I listened too closely. It felt like someone was playing with me the way a predator plays with prey, just to see how long I'd last before breaking. I never went back to that forest, and I never will. It happened nearly 8 years ago, and I still can't forget it. I was in my early 20s and camping deep in the wilderness of Upper Idaho. I wasn't an expert back then, but I hiked often enough to know the basics: how to start a fire, set up camp, and stay alert for wildlife. The area was known for its black bears and grizzlies, which kept casual campers away. That's exactly why I liked it. Empty trails, total silence, no people. For this trip, I picked a secluded route that skirted the edge of the mountain range. It wasn't popular or even marked on most maps. 3 miles away, there was another trail leading to a small lake that probably had other hikers, but I wanted isolation, so I avoided it. My hike there was quiet, no voices, no footprints, not even a bird call for long stretches. When I reached the clearing, the place looked perfect. I set up my tent on the far side of the open area and built a fire pit using heavy stones. The last hours of sunlight were peaceful. I sat by the flames roasting marshmallows and watching stars rise above the tree line. The breeze was cool, carrying the smell of pine and smoke. Then came the sound that shattered that peace, a steady crunch of leaves. It wasn't an animal. The rhythm was too human. Measured steps, slow, deliberate. My heart picked up. I grabbed my flashlight and called out, "Hello?" The sound stopped instantly. I aimed the beam into the dark but saw nothing, just trees and endless shadows. I told myself it was probably another camper passing through and forced myself to sit back down. 10 minutes later, the footsteps started again, closer this time, circling my camp. I stood up, flashlight shaking in my hand, and shouted again. Silence, no reply, no movement. The forest went still. I stayed awake for hours, knife in hand, listening until exhaustion finally won. When I woke, sunlight was streaming through the tent and the forest looked innocent again. I tried to laugh it off, but the memory of those footsteps wouldn't leave. I packed some food and went exploring down a nearby hill. The day was calm until I spotted something strange among the trees, a small figure about 100 feet away. It was a man. He wasn't moving, just standing there watching me. He wore a faded green jacket and a hat pulled low, his face hidden in shadow. For a moment, I thought he might be another hiker, but when I waved, he didn't move. He just stood there. I felt a chill and turned back toward camp, pretending not to care. When I looked again, he was gone. That night, I didn't sleep. Every sound outside my tent felt amplified. The creak of branches, the whisper of wind, the rustle of leaves. Around midnight, I heard movement again, slow and steady, circling just beyond the light of the dying fire. I called out, and something brushed against the side of my tent. I unzipped it in a panic and shined my light into the dark. No one was there. But on the dirt beside the tent were boot prints, fresh, deep, and large. I didn't sleep again after that. When the first hint of dawn broke, I tore down my tent, packed everything, and started heading back toward the car. Halfway down the trail, I caught sight of something that froze me in place. The same man standing about 50 yards behind me. He wasn't walking fast, just matching my pace, always staying the same distance away. I started walking faster, then jogging. He didn't run, didn't chase, just followed, like he knew I couldn't ignore him. My chest tightened as I reached the end of the trail and saw the road. I broke into a sprint, fumbled my keys, and finally got into the car. When I looked back, he was gone. I tried to convince myself it was paranoia. Maybe another hiker who happened to be going the same way. But later, when I looked back at photos from that trip, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. In one of the shots I'd taken of the mountain view, there was a faint figure between the trees in the background, a man in a green jacket and hat. I hadn't even seen him when I took the photo. It was midsummer, when I decided to rent one of those retired fire lookout towers my friend told me about. The idea fascinated me. Spending a night high above the forest, miles from anyone. The one I found was the most isolated listing available, built in the 1950s and barely restored. Only a single blurry photo existed online, but the thought of being alone on a mountain seemed perfect. I began the hike at 9 a.m. The trail wasn't really a trail anymore, just a faint path through dense wilderness. After 5 exhausting hours of climbing, I finally saw it. A squat wooden cabin perched on short stilts atop the mountain, surrounded by nothing but endless trees. Inside, the place was dusty and cold. A narrow cot, an old table, broken windows patched with boards. It smelled of rain and age, but it was shelter. As the sun set, I lit a lantern and ate dinner while the wind howled outside. Darkness fell heavy, and the forest became a black ocean beneath the tower. Around midnight, I heard footsteps on the metal stairs. Steady, deliberate. My breath caught. No cars were parked at the base. No other trail intersected here. Whoever was climbing up had come through 10 miles of pitch-black forest. A shadow passed the window. Then a knock. I hesitated but forced myself to answer. A man's voice said calmly, "Didn't mean to scare you. Just saw the light." He looked normal, mid-40s, scruffy beard, backpack. But something in his eyes unsettled me. He asked if he could rest inside for a bit, claiming he'd been hiking all day. Against my better judgment, I let him in. He thanked me, sat by the wall and warmed his hands near my lantern. The silence grew thick. I tried small talk, asked where he'd come from, but his answers were vague. He said he'd been around these parts before, his voice flat, distracted. Then, out of nowhere, he asked, "You ever seen her out here?" I frowned. "Seen who?" "The woman," he said softly. "She comes around the tower sometimes." A chill ran through me. I tried to laugh it off, but he kept staring at the window. "You'll know her when you see her," he added. "Don't talk to her." He stood suddenly, muttered something I couldn't catch, and left down the stairs. I watched his flashlight fade into the dark until even the beam disappeared. I locked the door and stayed awake the rest of the night, nerves raw. Around 3 a.m. I heard the footsteps again, but slower this time, dragging. When I peeked through a crack in the window, the man was back, standing at the bottom of the stairs, head tilted upward toward me. He wasn't moving, just staring. The lantern light barely reached his face, but I could see his lips moving silently, as if whispering to someone beside him. There was no one there. I didn't sleep. At dawn, he was gone. I packed and left immediately, hiking down the mountain without breakfast. Every few minutes I thought I heard something behind me, footsteps matching mine. But whenever I turned, the trail was empty. The next morning, I reported the incident to the ranger station. They told me no one else had checked out that tower in months. The register book confirmed it. My name was the only one written. The man's name was nowhere. Sometimes I think about what he said. "You'll know her when you see her." I still don't know who he meant, but part of me wonders if that man ever existed at all, or if he was warning me about something that hadn't yet come up the stairs. It was the summer of 2018, and I had just driven to Vermont to visit my family. After weeks of city noise, I craved the calm of the Appalachian woods I'd grown up near. When I lived with my parents, those trails were my escape, and I'd always wanted to explore a rumored abandoned lodge buried deep in the forest, a place I'd read about on a forum for people who hunted forgotten buildings. That Monday morning, I parked by the roadside and found the path, barely a path at all, overgrown and wild, clearly used only by explorers like me. The hike took nearly 2 hours, thick with weeds and brush, the kind that claw at your clothes and make you question your choices. But when I saw the outline of the lodge through the trees, excitement pushed the exhaustion aside. The building was massive, half sunken into decay, the roof sagging and walls coated in moss. The windows were shattered, the porch caved in, and ivy crawled up every beam. It was beautiful in that eerie, forgotten way. I had planned to sleep inside, but the place looked ready to collapse, so I set my tent a few yards away under a cluster of pines. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, the woods darkened fast, and the lodge stood there like a silhouette from another time. After dinner, I took my flashlight and walked the perimeter. Every step made the old boards creak somewhere inside, though no wind moved. Through one cracked window, I saw a long dining hall covered in broken chairs and tables overturned as if people had fled in a rush. On the wall above the fireplace, a single portrait still hung. A woman in a white dress, her face faded and water-streaked, yet her eyes seemed untouched, clear and staring right at me. That night, the forest was silent. I lay in my tent listening to nothing but my own heartbeat when a noise broke through. Laughter. Soft, distant, coming from the direction of the lodge. My skin crawled. It wasn't wild laughter. It sounded human, light and faint, like a woman's voice echoing through empty halls. I unzipped the tent and aimed the flashlight toward the building. Nothing moved. I told myself it was just the wind carrying sound oddly through the ruins, but as I settled back down, footsteps followed, slow, pacing ones, circling the tent. I froze, holding my breath. The steps stopped inches from the thin wall of nylon, then retreated. The laughter returned, this time closer, just outside. I could hear it clearly. A single giggle, sharp and quick, like someone amused by my fear. I stayed awake until the first light touched the trees. When I finally dared to look, the ground around my tent was undisturbed except for one thing. A perfect line of footprints leading from the lodge to the back of my tent, and then away into the woods. They were barefoot. I packed in minutes and started the hike out. Halfway down the trail, I glanced back one last time. Through the gaps in the trees, I saw the lodge glowing faintly in the morning light, and in the upper window, the outline of a woman in white watching. In 2015, I took a solo road trip to explore a remote forest several hours from home. Hidden deep inside was an old, abandoned fire lookout tower I'd read about online, a relic from the 1940s that hadn't been used in decades. Technically, entering or camping in it was illegal since it hadn't been maintained, but dozens of people had done it before me. The last post I found about it was 3 years old, so I didn't know what kind of shape it would be in. That uncertainty made it even more thrilling. I parked in a ditch beside a dirt road and started hiking with 2 days of supplies. There was no clear path, just dense forest and the constant hum of insects. My handheld GPS was my only guide, and the trek took nearly 5 hours of climbing through heavy brush and uneven terrain. When the tower finally came into view, it felt unreal. A tall, rusted structure rising above the trees, wooden legs thick with moss and rot. The stairs groaned under my weight as I climbed. The small cabin at the top was dusty, with a cot, an old radio, and windows facing every direction. Despite the decay, the view was breathtaking, endless green stretching for miles under the amber glow of sunset. I decided to spend the night there, convinced I was completely alone. When darkness fell, I lit my lantern, read for a while, and eventually dozed off. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a faint rhythmic thud, like metal tapping wood. At first I thought it was the wind, but then it grew more distinct. Footsteps on the stairs. My blood ran cold. No one should have been up here. I killed the lantern and waited. The steps stopped halfway. Then a beam of light swept across the walls, someone below shining a flashlight up toward me. I crawled to the window and peered down. There was a person at the base of the tower, holding a torch that flickered unnaturally bright, almost white instead of orange. They weren't moving, just standing there looking straight up at me. I ducked away from the window, my pulse racing. Minutes dragged by, but the light didn't move. Then, without warning, the footsteps started again, climbing fast this time. I froze, listening as the creaking wood drew closer. When they reached the last few steps, I slammed the trapdoor shut and locked it with the rusty latch. Silence. Then a long scrape against the hatch, metal dragging across wood. I backed into the corner, holding my pocket knife like it would actually help. The scraping stopped, replaced by a whispering voice, low and deliberate. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like a man talking softly to himself, or to someone else unseen. For nearly an hour, I stayed pressed against the far wall, listening to the faint sound of his breathing through the cracks in the floorboards. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. No footsteps going down, no sound at all. I waited until sunrise before daring to open the hatch. The stairs below were empty. On the ground, directly beneath the tower, was a small burned circle in the dirt, the remains of that torch still smoldering. I packed and left without breakfast, moving as fast as I could through the woods until I reached my car. Later that day, I looked up more information about the tower. A fire ranger's log from the 1960s mentioned an accident, a lookout who went missing one night after reporting someone climbing the stairs with a light. They never found him, but locals still talk about seeing a strange torch glowing in those woods long after the station was abandoned. I never went back. But sometimes when I hike alone and night begins to fall, I swear I can hear that faint creak of wooden steps in the dark, and I can almost feel that torchlight searching for me again. It was late summer when I decided to spend a weekend alone in the woods near my hometown. I'd grown up hiking there, so the forest felt familiar, safe even, which made what happened all the more unsettling. I brought my tent, food for 2 days, and a small speaker to play music at night while I read. It was supposed to be an easy, peaceful trip. The first night was calm. I built a fire, cooked, and listened to the forest hum around me. When the flames dimmed, I turned on my small lantern and lay back, enjoying the quiet. But around midnight, I woke to faint whispering outside my tent. My first thought was that I was dreaming. Then I heard it again. 2 distinct voices, low and fast, as if arguing just beyond the thin layer of fabric between us. My chest tightened. I unzipped the tent slightly and peered out. The fire was cold, the woods black. I couldn't see anyone. Then a branch snapped to my left, followed by laughter, soft, breathy, almost playful. I shouted, asking who was there. The voices stopped. For a full minute, the forest was silent again. The next morning, I found footprints near the edge of the clearing. Not mine, and not from any animal I could recognize. They were barefoot, deep in the mud, and there were at least 2 sets. I told myself it had to be locals messing around, but the unease never left me. That night I kept the fire going bright and sat with my back to a tree, knife in hand. Hours passed quietly. Around 2 in the morning, the fire cracked sharply, and from somewhere deep in the woods came a single drawn-out whistle. Then a voice called, "Henry." My blood ran cold. Nobody out here should have known my name. The voice came again, closer this time and different, like someone imitating my friend's tone but just slightly off. "Henry, come here." I didn't move. My heart hammered as I listened to the words repeat, every time a little louder, a little more distorted. Then from the opposite direction another voice answered, "He's not there." I stood up slowly, eyes darting through the trees. I couldn't see a thing beyond the circle of firelight. I packed my bag with shaking hands, ready to leave immediately, when I caught a glimpse of something between the trees, a flicker of white like a shirt, gone in an instant. I grabbed my lantern and ran down the trail toward the road, but within minutes I realized the whispering was following me, moving parallel through the woods. The voices were close enough to hear words now, fragments that didn't make sense. "He's running. Wait, he'll stop soon." I sprinted until my legs gave out. The woods were endless, shadows alive with motion I couldn't fully see. Finally, I broke through the trees and stumbled onto the gravel road, collapsing by the edge. The whispers stopped the moment my feet hit open ground. When I looked back, a figure stood at the tree line, too far to see clearly but close enough that I knew it wasn't my imagination. I drove home that night shaking. A week later, I went back with police to show them where it happened. They found nothing, no footprints, no signs of anyone else ever being there. But even now, sometimes when I hike near that forest, I still hear faint voices drifting through the trees. They never say my name anymore. They just laugh. I grew up in a small town bordered by thick woods that stretched for miles. Behind our house, the forest began almost immediately, a wall of green that seemed endless when I was a kid. It had always been my playground, a place for exploring, climbing trees, and pretending I was miles away from civilization. When I got older, it became my refuge whenever I needed to think or escape life for a while. I never feared those woods, not until the night something started watching from them. It began subtly. Late one summer evening, I sat on the back porch scrolling through my phone when I heard a twig snap near the tree line. I brushed it off at first. Deer came through often. But then another sound followed. Slow, heavy footsteps, deliberate and steady, not like an animal's. I shined my flashlight toward the trees, but the beam revealed only layers of trunks and shadows. The footsteps stopped the moment the light hit the area. The next night it happened again. Same time, same place. The sound of someone walking just inside the woods, never coming closer, never leaving. It went on for nearly 10 minutes before fading away. My dog growled softly the entire time, staring straight at the dark. That's when I started to realize it wasn't my imagination. After the third night, I decided to check it out. Just before sunset, I set up my lawn chair facing the woods with a bright flashlight in my lap. For a while, nothing happened. Crickets chirped, the air cooled, and darkness crept in. Then I heard it, faint, rhythmic breathing. I aimed the light and caught a glimpse of something pale moving between two trees. My stomach dropped. It was a person, standing completely still, head tilted slightly, watching me. I shouted and ran inside to grab my phone, but when I came back out, the figure was gone. I called the police, who searched the yard and the forest edge. They found footprints, definitely human, but they stopped abruptly a few feet into the woods as if the person had vanished into thin air. The next night, I double-checked every lock and kept the lights on. Around midnight, the motion sensor by the shed went off. Through the window, I saw the beam of light flick on, and a shadow move behind it. I crept to the back door, peered out, and saw a man standing in the middle of the yard facing the house. He didn't move or speak. He just stood there, illuminated by the soft yellow light, as if waiting for me to step outside. My hands shook as I called the police again. When they arrived minutes later, the yard was empty. This time they searched deeper into the woods. Near the stream behind our property, they found a small makeshift camp, a tarp, a sleeping bag, and a half-burned log fire. Someone had been living there. Among the scattered belongings was a small notebook filled with sketches of houses, including mine. The police cleared everything out and told us it was probably a drifter who'd moved on, but I never felt safe after that. For weeks, I thought I saw movement between the trees whenever I glanced out my window at night. Eventually, the fear faded, replaced by that uneasy memory. Now, years later, when I visit my parents and step out onto that porch, I still feel it. That same quiet weight pressing from the woods. And sometimes when the wind dies down, I could swear I hear footsteps again, slow and steady, stopping just at the edge of the trees. Last summer, I decided to backpack into one of my favorite trails with my dog, Rocky, an Australian shepherd with sharp instincts and more courage than sense. We'd been on this trail several times before, deep in the woods where no one ever went. I liked that isolation. It meant freedom, quiet, and space for Rocky to run off leash without bothering anyone. The campsite was a small clearing about 8 hours down the trail, a place surrounded completely by trees and silence. We arrived just before sunset, the light cutting in thin orange lines between the trunks. As usual, Rocky did his perimeter check while I unpacked and pitched the tent. But when he came back this time, something was off. His tail was low, his ears flat, his body tense. He walked right up to me, then turned toward the forest he'd just come from, staring into the trees. I called his name, but he didn't move. No growling, no barking, just that strange stillness. I checked his paws, thinking maybe he'd stepped on something sharp, but he was unhurt. He simply wouldn't look away from the woods. The air felt heavy. I tried to shake the feeling that we were being watched. But every time I glanced into that darkness, the unease tightened. As night fell, I built the fire and cooked dinner, hoping the warmth would settle us both. Rocky stayed close beside me instead of wandering like usual. He wouldn't even eat until I did. The forest was so quiet it felt unnatural. No insects, no rustle of leaves, just the faint hiss of the fire. An hour after sunset, Rocky's head snapped up. His ears twitched, his eyes fixed on the same direction as before. I followed his gaze but saw nothing, just a black wall of trees. Then he started to whine, low and desperate. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it ahead, the beam cutting through the dark like a blade. Nothing. Still, my gut told me something was out there. I took a few cautious steps toward the tree line, Rocky following tightly at my heel. The light caught on something, the faint glint of metal deep between the trees, gone in an instant. Then a shape moved. I froze. It was low to the ground at first, then rose upright. My breath caught in my throat. I could barely make out the outline of a person standing just beyond the reach of the light, perfectly still. Rocky barked, a sharp, terrified sound. The figure stepped back into the dark and disappeared. We retreated fast back to the campfire. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the flashlight. I threw more wood into the flames until the light grew strong again, trying to convince myself I hadn't really seen anyone. But Rocky didn't stop growling. Every few minutes his eyes darted to the same spot in the trees. Sleep was impossible. I sat up all night watching the forest, the fire flickering low. Just before dawn, I thought I heard breathing, deep, uneven, coming from somewhere behind the tent. I didn't even look. I grabbed my pack, whistled for Rocky, and we left before the sun broke the horizon. When I finally reached the car, I turned to look back one last time. Rocky's fur was raised, and he growled low as if warning me not to. Through the trees, I saw movement. Not a person this time, but something crouched low, watching us leave. I don't camp at that site anymore. Rocky still reacts whenever we drive past the road that leads there. He growls quietly, staring into the forest as if he knows it's still out there, waiting. It was early autumn when two friends and I decided to camp near the old Pine Hollow trails, a long abandoned route that hadn't been maintained for years. The place had a strange reputation among locals, mostly stories about people getting lost or hearing things at night, but we laughed those off. We were experienced enough campers and thought the quiet would make for a perfect weekend. We parked at the edge of the forest just before dusk, loaded our packs and hiked for a few miles until we found an open space near a creek. It was perfect, a flat, secluded, ringed by tall birches. By the time darkness fell, the fire was burning strong and our laughter filled the clearing. The forest around us was silent, the only sound the steady trickle of water nearby. Around midnight, the fire began to dim, and the three of us fell quiet. I remember staring into the flames, feeling that odd heaviness that sometimes comes with too much silence. Then came the first sound of footsteps. Slow, steady, and unmistakably human, moving through the brush just beyond the circle of light. We froze. My friend Kyle grabbed a flashlight and shined it toward the sound, but the beam caught only trees and shadows. Probably a deer, he muttered, though his voice wasn't convincing. The steps stopped the instant the light hit. A few minutes later, when we'd begun to relax again, a voice called out from the darkness. Just one word. Hello. It was calm, almost polite, but the way it echoed through the trees made my blood run cold. Kyle called back, asking who was there. Silence followed, then a low laugh, faint and breathy. That was enough for us. We tossed more wood into the fire, making it blaze bright again, trying to feel safe under its glow. We stayed awake another hour before finally crawling into our tents. I left the fire burning, small but steady, just in case. Sleep didn't come easily. Every crack of wood or brush outside made my pulse jump. At some point, I must have drifted off because when I opened my eyes again, everything was dark. The fire was out. I crawled halfway out of the tent to relight it, but the fire pit was empty. The stones were still there, but all the wood and ash had been cleared away, as if someone had scraped it clean. That's when I saw them, footprints circling the tent, dozens of them. Bare feet pressed deep into the damp soil, walking in a perfect ring around where we slept. I whispered Kyle's name. No answer. I turned toward his tent, unzipped it slowly. Empty. My heart slammed against my ribs as I looked toward the trees. Something moved there, tall, thin, and shifting between the trunks. I grabbed my pack and ran, yelling for my friends. The woods exploded with sound. Footsteps running from every direction, too many to count. Branches snapped, leaves thrashed. I sprinted through the dark until my legs gave out, tripping over roots and stones. Somehow I found the creek and followed it until I saw the faint glow of dawn. Hours later, I reached the car. Kyle and our other friend were already there, pale and shaking. None of us had seen the others leave camp, but all three of us woke to find the fire gone and the same footprints circling our tents. We never found out who, or what, was walking around us that night. But every one of us swore the footsteps belonged to more than one person, and none of them wore shoes. It was late October when I went hiking with my older cousin, Adam. The plan was to spend 2 nights in the backcountry, following a forest trail we hadn't explored before. We both loved camping off-grid. No crowds, no cell service, just isolation. The air that weekend was cold and sharp, the sky a deep gray that never quite brightened all day. By evening, we stumbled across an old wooden cabin half buried in the trees. It was small and crooked, but the roof looked solid, and the idea of not sleeping in the wind was too good to pass up. Inside, it smelled of damp earth and smoke, but there were a few rusted pans on a table and an old stone fireplace. It looked abandoned for decades. We unpacked our gear and started a fire inside. The flicker of the flames made the cabin feel smaller, shadows twisting along the walls. There was writing scratched into the wooden planks. Names, dates, maybe a few carved warnings we couldn't fully read. We joked that it looked like something out of a horror movie, though deep down I could tell we both felt uneasy. That night, the wind picked up. The trees outside moaned with each gust and the fire crackled in the corner. I woke sometime after midnight to what I thought was that same wind, until I heard it again. A sound that didn't belong. It was crying, soft, muffled, and coming from outside. It wasn't the cry of an animal or the wail of the wind. It was unmistakably human, high-pitched, almost childlike, and distant. I sat up, heart pounding. Adam was already awake, staring at the door. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. We listened. The crying came again, this time closer, just beyond the walls. Adam grabbed the flashlight and aimed it through the small window, but the beam hit nothing but the fog thickening between the trees. The crying stopped immediately, replaced by silence so deep I could hear the crackle of the fire and my own heartbeat. Adam muttered that it had to be some hiker lost in the woods, maybe calling for help, but neither of us moved. There was something wrong about that sound, something off about how it stopped the moment we reacted. Minutes passed. Then a slow knock echoed through the cabin. 3 soft taps on the wood. I felt my chest tighten. Adam swung the flashlight toward the door and shouted, "Who's there?" No answer. He stepped closer, hand trembling on the latch. The knock came again, this time on the window behind us. We spun around, but there was no one there. The glass was cracked and fogged over, but in the reflection of the firelight I thought I saw movement, a pale shape gliding just outside the wall. The crying returned, louder now, circling the cabin. Adam threw another log on the fire, his hands shaking. "We wait till sunrise," he said. "We're not opening that door." Neither of us slept. The crying continued for hours, moving from one side of the cabin to the other, rising and falling like someone walking around us in slow circles. Sometimes it was near the door, other times behind the cabin. Once I swore it came from the roof. When dawn finally came, the sound was gone. We packed our things and left without breakfast. A few hundred yards down the trail I turned back for one last look. Through the morning mist I could barely see the outline of the cabin. In one of the windows something pale pressed against the glass, a handprint, small and smeared as if left from the inside. I still don't know what was crying out there that night. But part of me is sure it wasn't asking for help. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip. 2 friends, me and Ethan, heading into the woods for a 2-night camping getaway. We'd both needed a break from the city, from screens and schedules, so we chose a quiet spot by a lake deep in the forest. The drive took nearly 4 hours, and by the time we arrived, the sun was low enough that the trees had turned gold, and the air smelled of pine and cold water. The first night went perfectly. We built a fire, cooked, shared beers, and talked about everything from old memories to new plans. The woods were calm, the water flat like glass. When we finally crawled into our tents, I remember thinking it was the most peaceful I'd felt in months. That changed the next night. Around dusk, Ethan decided to walk down to the lake alone to wash up while I stayed behind to prepare dinner. He said he'd be back in 20 minutes. Half an hour passed. Then 40. I figured he got distracted taking photos and he was like that. But when the light began to fade and the forest started to close in, I grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the lake. The trail wound down a slope through tall, thin trees. The sound of frogs and insects was constant, but I didn't hear Ethan. When I reached the water's edge, I called out his name. No response. My light skimmed over rippling water, rocks, and shadows, but the place looked empty. Then I noticed something. Faint ripples spreading near the opposite bank as if someone had just moved through. "Ethan?" I shouted. Nothing. I waited a few more minutes before heading back, my stomach knotted. Halfway up the trail, I stopped. The air had gone utterly still. No insects, no movement, just the faint crackle of a fire from our campsite up ahead. I quickened my pace, relief flooding me. He must have come back before me, I thought. But as I approached the clearing, something felt wrong. The fire was blazing higher than before, as if fresh wood had been thrown in. A figure stood beside it, tall and motionless. My first thought was Ethan. Until the man turned his head toward me, he froze, staring. Then, without a word, he sprinted into the trees. My heart jumped into my throat. Whoever that was, it wasn't Ethan. I ran the rest of the way to camp, calling his name. Seconds later, Ethan burst out of the woods on the opposite side, breathless and pale. "We have to go," he gasped. "Now." I barely managed to ask what happened when he explained that on his way back from the lake, he'd seen someone walking toward him along the shore. Tall, thin, with a strange stiff gait. At first he thought it was me, but when the figure stepped into the moonlight, its face looked wrong. The skin too smooth, the expression too wide, like it was trying to imitate a smile but didn't know how. Ethan said he'd called out, and the figure had just kept walking closer, smiling. That's when he ran. When I told him about the man I'd seen by the fire, we both understood what this was. Someone had been watching us, maybe from the first night. We didn't waste another second. We packed frantically, throwing gear into our bags while glancing into the dark. Every sound, every shift of leaves felt like footsteps. The hike back to the car was the longest of our lives. Every few minutes, one of us swore we heard something following, a branch snapping, soft breathing just beyond sight. But we never saw anyone again. When we finally reached the car and locked the doors, neither of us spoke. The forest around us was utterly still. Even now, years later, we still talk about that trip, about the man who moved wrong, whose face looked almost human, and who stood by our fire as if waiting for one of us to return alone. We both know one thing for certain. Whoever, or whatever he wasn't lost. He found us on purpose. In 2019, I agreed to house sit for my older brother while he was away on a 3-day work trip. He didn't want to leave his dog, Cooper, with strangers, so I drove up to his cabin to watch him. I call it a cabin, but it was more like a regular suburban house tucked deep in the woods, miles from any main road. The kind of place that feels peaceful in the day but unsettling once the sun goes down. My brother left around 3 that afternoon. The day passed easily. I unpacked, played with Cooper, and relaxed by the fire. By dusk, I thought it might be nice to sit outside and watch the sunset. I built a small campfire in the yard, Cooper lying beside me as the sun dipped behind the tree line. For a while, it was perfect. The air was still, the woods quiet except for the occasional chirp of crickets. But once the light was gone, the silence turned heavy. The forest became black and infinite. The fire's glow only lit a few feet around me, and the rest of the world vanished into darkness. After 10 minutes, my nerves gave in. I doused the fire and went back inside, locking the door behind me. I put on a movie, ironically a horror one, and laid on the couch with Cooper curled against me. The warmth of the room and the long drive had me drifting in and out of sleep. At some point, I woke up to realize Cooper wasn't beside me anymore. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the TV. I called his name softly, expecting him to trot back wagging his tail. He didn't. When I sat up, I saw him, sitting by the front door, completely still, ears up, staring straight ahead. "Coop," I whispered. He didn't react. I stood and walked closer, my hand brushing his fur. He was trembling slightly. His eyes never left the door. I leaned down and looked through the peephole. Nothing but the yard and trees beyond. I cracked the door open just a few inches and peeked outside. The darkness felt thick, suffocating, but I didn't see or hear a thing. No footsteps, no animals, no wind. I closed the door again, locking it. When I turned around, Cooper was pacing now, his nails clicking against the wood floor, low growls rumbling in his chest. I tried calming him, but he only grew more agitated. Then 3 slow knocks echoed through the door. Knock, knock, knock. Cooper barked furiously, lunging toward the sound. My blood went cold. I froze where I stood. Whoever was out there didn't say a word. I waited, every nerve on edge, listening. After a minute, I looked through the peephole again. Still nothing. I backed away, grabbed my phone, and dialed my brother, whispering what had just happened. He told me to check the security camera he'd installed above the porch. My hand shook as I opened the app. The live feed loaded, pitch black at first. Then the motion sensor flicked on. Someone was standing at the edge of the porch. A man. Motionless. His head tilted toward the door as if listening. His face was impossible to make out under the hood of his jacket, but his outline was unmistakable. I whispered, "There's someone out there." The second I said it, he turned, slowly, deliberately, toward the camera, and then the feed cut to static. Cooper barked louder, his body shaking as he stood between me and the door. I retreated to the living room and grabbed a kitchen knife, my heart slamming in my chest. For almost 20 minutes, nothing happened. Then the motion light outside blinked off, leaving the porch dark again. I stayed awake until dawn. When sunlight finally hit the windows, I dared to open the door. The yard looked untouched, except for one thing. In the dirt near the porch steps were footprints, deep and clear. They led up to the door, and then vanished. My brother called later that morning to say the camera had gone offline right after my call. It never recorded a thing. I still don't know who that man was or how long he'd been watching the house. But sometimes, when I stay there now, Cooper will still sit by that door at night, staring into the trees, like he's waiting for something to come back. The second night I spent in that old fire lookout tower was worse than the first. I hadn't planned to leave early, but something about the man I'd met the night before wouldn't leave my mind. He'd appeared out of nowhere, asking strange questions, and even after he left, I couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't really gone. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting, that maybe he was just another hiker passing through. But sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps below the tower, slow, deliberate steps pacing back and forth on the gravel. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound stopped, and after a moment I told myself it was probably an animal. Then came the knock, soft but distinct, on the metal stair rail. I froze. Whoever was down there knew I was awake. I turned out my lantern and crouched by the window, peering into the darkness. Moonlight spilled faintly across the clearing, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure moving between the trees, just standing half hidden, staring up at the tower. I stayed still for what felt like hours until the sounds faded, but I couldn't sleep again. Just before dawn, I packed my bag, deciding to cut the trip short and hike out as soon as the light was strong enough. As I started down the stairs, I looked around one last time, and there, near the base of the tower, I saw it, a small pile of stones arranged in a perfect circle with a single object placed in the middle. My pocket knife, the same one I'd left beside my cot upstairs. My stomach dropped. Someone had been inside the tower while I slept. I didn't think. I ran, down the mountain, through the trees, not stopping until the sun was high and the road finally appeared ahead. Only when I reached my car did I dare look back. The tower stood like a skeleton against the sky, silent and empty. But even from that distance, I thought I saw movement, a shadow in the window watching me leave. Later, when I reported it, the ranger told me the tower hadn't been booked by anyone else for weeks. Which means that man, whoever he was, knew I'd be there. He knew how long I planned to stay. And if I hadn't left that morning, I'm certain I wouldn't have left at all.